I think he had what he called himself a vision of Canada, which animated him and which gave him that strength and that ability to communicate with people and to create bonds which every politician attempts to develop in himself, but very few succeed. And that's probably why there's a lot of history that goes with John Diefenbaker, and he will be remembered as not only a great performer in Parliament, but as a man who, till the very end, when he could have retired, wanted to stay on and do what he thought best, to advise the country and to serve the country.
Like Winston Churchill, John George Diefenbaker left behind highly detailed instructions for his own funeral arrangements. His body will lie in state tomorrow and Saturday in the center block of Parliament, his political home for the past 40 years. A funeral service will be held Sunday in Ottawa's Christ Church Cathedral. The body of his second wife, Olive, who was buried in Ottawa in 1976, will be disinterred. And together they will be carried by rail back to the prairies for burial in Saskatoon on Wednesday at the site of the Diefenbaker Center. And the train will make stops along the way so the public can pay tribute as he journeys home.
One of John Diefenbaker's favorite stories was that as a young boy he once sold a newspaper to Sir Wilfrid Laurier and told him his ambition was to be Prime Minister one day. He achieved his ambition about half a century later after a career in law and early frustrations in politics. He scored one of the greatest upsets in Canadian political history, won the biggest election victory, and suffered some of the most ignominious defeats. Through it all, he always felt he had a destiny and a dream. Tom Leach has prepared this report on the life and times of the political John Diefenbaker.
Although he was born in Ontario, John Diefenbaker was raised in Saskatchewan and always thought of himself primarily as a Westerner. World War I service overseas interrupted his studies for the law. But in 1919, he was called to the bar, and in 1940, after several unsuccessful tries, made it to the Commons. In 1956, on his third try, Diefenbaker was elected Tory party leader. A year later came the real test, a national election campaign. The Liberals seemed entrenched in office and had grown overconfident after 22 years in control. Dief's homespun philosophizing on the campaign trail won him the PM's office, but not an overall majority.
I say this to you, my fellow Canadians, this evening. We shall neither fail nor falter along the road on which you have set our feet. We shall be true to your trust.
The 1958 campaign was to become historic. It gave Diefenbaker and his vision of national greatness the biggest majority ever afforded a Canadian Prime Minister. Even during the campaign, the Liberals could see the writing on the wall as Canadians turned out in their thousands to Diefenbaker's rallies. Back in Ottawa, after the massive win, Diefenbaker met the press before settling down to develop his vision of the North and plan his Bill of Rights. The happy beginnings included a trip to London for a meeting with his old friend Winston Churchill. And as always, the old monarchist was only too willing at any time to greet the Queen. The meetings, he felt, were not only personally pleasurable, but gave public witness to his belief that the monarchy had always been and should remain an essential element in the Canadian way of life. Relations with the Americans were less cordial, despite appearances. But even in politics, there was always room for humor.
We like to get good press notices. I have had my billings. Some tell me that every knock's a boost. Well, all I can say is that if it is, I've had enough to drive a rocket to the moon.
And then, crisis. Despite the smiles, Diefenbaker's cabinet was disintegrating around him over his refusal to make a decision on accepting American nuclear warheads for Canadian missiles. It was a prelude to political disaster. In 1962, Diefenbaker lost his majority. In 1963, he was out altogether.
Effective on Monday next, at the hour of 12 o'clock noon. He will proceed to provide an opportunity for my successor to take office.
In Ottawa, the party summoned Diefenbaker to appear before it and account for his leadership. He rode out the first storm with a savage attack on his enemies within the party and an emotional appeal that brought him to tears.
I want to know where I stand. I want to know where you stand, too. That's what I want to know.
But Dalton Camp and Diefenbaker's other foes were not through. Over Diefenbaker's objections, Camp retained his post as party president, and the party called a leadership convention. The chief acknowledged he'd been gravely hurt.
I am wounded, but I am not slain.
Then the convention, and in what he called later the bitterest moment of his life, Diefenbaker was thrown out.
The next Prime Minister of Canada, Bob Stanton.
Time then for quiet reflection. On his favorite Caribbean island, Diefenbaker drafted his memoirs in which he apportioned blame for his downfall equally between his liberal opponents and his enemies within his own party. It was also time for his last months with his wife Olive, a woman he adored from the time he met her and from whose death he never really recovered. His devotion showed at the unveiling of a painting in Olive's honor in the parliamentary restaurant.
It's not always difficult for me to find words, but it is on this occasion. She lived. She met the leaders of the world. Churchill said of her, "There is only one Olive." And so it went all over the world. Olive never let you, the representatives of the Conservative Party or the people of Canada, down.
May 22, 1979. Diefenbaker's 13th and last victory in a federal election. A word with his opponent, and his thoughts still, as they always had been, on the unity of his country.
You put up an admirable campaign. The essence of democracy is that each one of us accepts the right of others to disagree. But we're still Canadians first and foremost, and nothing is going to divide us.